Oh, it's on. Hello. I have been instructed against my will to remain seated while talking, and there is some relationship between my vocal cords and my knees, which means I'm very uncomfortable speaking from a seated position. So, sorry in advance about that. So, welcome everybody. Lovely to see you all here on what I'm fairly certain is a Monday evening. So, very good of you all to make it out for this. We're very pleased to be launching this new book today, which is called Using Randomised Controlled Trials to Improve Children's Social Care, Evidence, Challenges and Opportunities. And when I wrote the proposal for the book, I presume that I wrote that title into it, and I now immediately regret how long of a title it is and how difficult it is to remember. So it's an important lesson for those of you who plan on writing books in the future. Short, pithy titles are probably better, otherwise you embarrass yourself. But I embarrass myself nearly constantly anyway, and so I will say as little as possible over the course of this evening. So I am your chair, I'm Michael Sanders. I'm a Professor of Public Policy and Director of the School for Government here at King's. I'm also Director of the Experimental Government Team, which does experiments to try and make government better. I am delighted to have an excellent panel of expert people who are going to talk expertly and excellently about some of the topics contained within the book, which will allow me to sit here and look pensive and thoughtful for the duration and then to field questions afterwards. Does that sound like an okay way of arranging things? Excellent, because if it didn't, I did not have a second plan. I will introduce our wonderful panelists in turn, and they will then speak in the order that I have introduced them, and if I have introduced them in the wrong order, then they will not speak in the order that I've introduced them. So you can see the accuracy of my recollection based on the order in which people actually speak versus the order in which I have said their names. It's all a fun game of, like, I guess it's like Guess Who, kind of, but without much of the thrill. Seated to my left, and from your perspective, my right, is Isabel Trowler, CB, who is the Chief Social Worker for Children and Families for England, and is the only person ever to hold that post. The unique.
Holding tight.
Yes. Isabel is very wonderful, and I have to say that because I'm terrified of her. But also was very kind to give me a job a few years ago, so that was excellent of her, and has really been in government one of the driving forces behind having more randomised controlled trials in children's social care, which is something about which I am unsurprisingly deeply passionate, otherwise I wouldn't have done a book about it. Next to speak will be Dave Westlake, David Westlake. Dave's fine. Who is, I think, a Principal Research Fellow.
Yes.
At the Cascade Centre at Cardiff University, and when Dave starts to talk, he will tell you what Cascade stands for, because I can never remember.
No, neither can I. Something to do with children's social care, I think.
Something, yeah, probably, you'd hope. Dave will be followed by Sarah Taylor, who is Head of Research, Director of Research? Head of Research for the Children's Commissioner, and then my wonderful colleague Vanessa Hiernais will speak at the end, and she is a research associate and a doctoral student, newly minted doctoral student in the Policy Institute at King's. So that leads me to the end of my slightly meandering monologue, and I will now hand over to Isabel. Over to you.
Excellent. Okay, you can hear me well, yeah? Great. So, the benefit of being around for so long, as you kindly pointed out, is that you tend to have institutional memory. Now, that sounds good, doesn't it? But it's entirely predicated on the assumption that you can actually remember what happened and when. So I had to call a friend to help me this morning, and that was Alan Wood, who isn't here this evening, but he should be. But he played a very crucial role in the development of the What Works Centre. So I'm going to tell you a bit about the story behind the What Works Centre. And this is entirely my perspective. I'm very conscious of the fact that Richard White is sitting over here, who was also with me throughout all of those years, and he is a civil servant in the Department for Education. So I'm sure he'll correct me if I get it wrong. But I had to rustle through a lot of paperwork, spoke to Alan, thought it through a lot, and I can remember how I felt, and I can remember how other people told me they felt. But I can't quite remember the order of events, okay? So you're going to have to bear with me. But the good news is that my short-term memory is great. And so good, in fact, that I can remember the last spending review. And in April 2025, Children's Social Care secured 2.5 billion money to implement our reform agenda. And I have no doubt that one of the core reasons that we got that money is that we were finally able to show to Treasury and others that when we do something and we follow best evidence, then we can achieve great things for children and families. So this is the fruition of a decade of hard slog involving multiple people. And so I'm going to give you a potted history of the development of the What Works Centre. It'll be a familiar walk down memory lane to some of you, and for others, I hope that it's a story that's worth knowing. So once upon a time, in 2014, we set up the innovation programme in the Department for Education. £200 million for new ideas and evaluation. For us, this was groundbreaking. It was exhilarating, and the beginning of a sea change in evidence building, and specifically in children's social care. Because up to this point, thousands of us in children's social care think we know how to run things, how best to work with children and families, the skills that you need, the system that you need to build around those skills. I certainly felt that I knew what would make a difference, but for everything I said we should do, 10 people said something completely different. And yes, we did have quite a lot of evidence about particular types of evidence-based programmes, and yes, we did have a lot of social work academic research over the years, but certainly the latter was not able to cut the mustard within the competition for public funds. We embraced failure. We learned a huge amount, even when we didn't get the outcomes that we wanted. David Halpin, God of all things, What Works Centre, was hugely supportive, but I'm sure, in fact I know, sometimes had his head in his hands with when he saw some of the quality of the evaluation we did. But we got better at it. And much of the sector was furious at the amount of the money we were spending on evaluation. They were furious at how it got in the way of delivery, and they were furious that RCTs were even mooted. And at points that pressure was enormous. But it's a textbook lesson on how to hold the line, is that any long-term strategy will falter or fail if you don't hold the line. So family safeguarding, family valued, no wrong door, mockingbird, lifelong links, pause, family group decision making, these are professional household names now in 2025. And the role of the What Works Centre in securing that is phenomenal. This was not an accident. We were really clear during that innovation period that what we were developing, if we didn't lock it down into an institution, the discipline of building new ideas to the point where they can be further tested, refined and scaled, that in 10 years' time, everything that we had built would have disappeared. And now 10 years later, as a seasoned civil servant and watching the ebb and flow of politics around me, I'm pretty sure that that is what would have happened. So, back to the chronology of events. Alan said I'd have bored you to death if I went through the minutiae of this, but I'm going to do it, but with a really quick canter, because I want to just at least give a nod to some of the people that have played a part. So, why children's social care? Why not wider? Why not children? Tactically, it was the right decision to keep it narrow at that point. We needed to get this very small but expensive part of the public sector system on the radar of people who needed to know about us. I called it, to David Halpin, the £10 billion problem that we needed to solve. DFE commissioned Nesta and Cascade at Cardiff, and they're here tonight, to incubate the What Works Centre. Greg Wilkinson, he's not here, is he? He said it was like herding cats. There were so many of us that were trying to get something off the ground, but all going in a slightly different direction. So Alan became chair, we became a legal entity. Alan, Jonathan Brecken, Sally Rowe and I became company directors. And then we were incredibly lucky to be introduced to Michael Sanders, a phenomenal and pivotal person in this story, and he became our chief executive. He moved us swiftly to charitable status, and then we recruited a board of trustees, and we were in a settled state. Alan stepped down, Jenny Coles came into the frame. Now, throughout all of that, Michael had to fight tooth and nail to get RCTs up and running. Resistance was everywhere. But social workers in schools, the stepped wedge RCT of family safeguarding, happier, healthy professionals, sports round, to name a few. And, you know, a personal reflection at this point is that I still have very little idea what a step-wedged RCT is. But when you're building something like this, you have to find people whose judgment you trust, because you just can't know everything. And I trusted the What Works Centre. I fought many a battle on its behalf, and I'm very glad that I took that punt. Many of us have lived through the heady days of evidence-based programmes under the Blair years and the pros and cons of those, while running complex organisations working with very high risk and high volume. So right from the outset, we were looking at both individual interventions for families, but we also wanted to understand whole system functioning around that. And Michael and colleagues delivered that understanding for us. In December 2022, we merged with the Early Intervention Foundation. I shouldn't say we, should we? But I'm very connected to this story. But Foundations was born, and that is also a fantastic institution. It's continuing the work of the What Works Centre. It's still invested in RCTs. It's producing brilliant practice guides, which are making its way to connect to statutory guidance for what we want to see in practice. They're a key partner in our reform programme. So just to close, the impact of the What Works Centre has been phenomenal. It's been a huge journey, a leap of faith for many people, a very wise investment by a series of politicians and senior civil servants. And the best example in recent times is when high quality evidence hits the statute books. And we have a bill going through Parliament at the moment, the Children and Welfare Bill, which will secure family group decision making on the back of the world's largest RCT on family group conferencing. So a joint endeavour, many individuals, but also local authorities have played a massive role in this, that none of this would have happened if they hadn't played ball despite their reservations. So it's a very good news story. We have to continue to fight for resource. We have to keep building the pipeline for future innovations through to RCTs and other high-level evidence. So thanks for everybody here that was involved and listening online, but it has been a success story. Thank you.
Thank you. I have just checked the acronym CASCADE. It's, and I always get this wrong. It's Children's Social Care Research and Development Centre. So we do lots of research in children's social care and a bit of kind of related fields, but mostly within children's social care. One of the great things about that field is it's kind of a melting pot of different disciplines. So you find yourself working with psychologists, economists, public health people, obviously social workers, and I think one of the really good things about that mix of different ideas coming together is that it's allowed us to drive the field forward in recent years, and it's enabled a lot of the stuff that Isabel just talked about. So the book's full of innovations, case studies, examples of researchers kind of finding their way through difficult sort of practical problems and methodological challenges. And we're really grateful for the authors of each chapter bringing their extensive expertise and experience to the book. So thanks everyone who was involved. I'm going to take a few of the chapters and a few studies that I've been involved in and just pull out some highlights. Starting with the first RCT that I was involved in, and this was over a decade ago now. It's the subject of chapter 8 in the book, and it's about a type of communication style called motivational interviewing. This is something that has been proven to be effective in other fields, particularly addictions. We tried to see whether it would work in social work to help social workers increase engagement with families. So the idea was to randomise families to either go to a worker who'd had this training or a worker who was yet to receive the training, and to see what the consequences were. And I think it's true for any study, but particularly for an RCT, you've got to spend a lot of time in the early stages working with local authorities, making sure people know what's going on, they understand randomisation, and they're on board. So Donald Forrester and I were setting up the study here in London with a local authority. We'd had several meetings with senior managers, and during one of these meetings, we thought it was going quite well, but one of them stood up and stopped us and said, we were explaining randomisation, how we could do it ethically and so on. They stood up and said, that's all very well, but if a child is at risk, you can stick your randomisation up your arse. Now, I've been trying to get this into print for many years, and as you can tell, Journals obviously thought it was too rude, so various rejections. So I'm having to settle for a censored version, which is part of the title of chapter 1 in the book. And it's a memorable comment for various reasons, but I think partly because it captures something really important, and that's the tension that we're trying to unpick in the book. Between, on one hand, doing rigorous research that creates good evidence for policymakers, and on the other hand, the messy realities of social work practice. And those two things don't always kind of align, because in a sense, the service manager who said that wasn't wrong. The stakes are high. We're working with children and families who need help and often protection, and that's always going to supersede any research priorities we might have, and rightly so. So you might say, well, why would you randomise them into anything? One of the common criticisms of RCTs in children's social care is this idea that they're a kind of recent import from medicine, and they don't quite fit the sort of the social picture as well as they do when you're testing a drug. But what might surprise you is that actually social work RCTs are not new. The Cambridge Somerville Youth Study took place in the 1930s, 1935. It's kind of vaunted as the first criminology RCT, but I think you could equally say it's a social work intervention. That was 8 years before the first proper medical RCT. And I think the findings from that study should make anyone cautious about assuming that good intentions lead to good outcomes, because the intervention actually made things worse. So it was a study that looked at offending, involved boys who were at risk of offending. The intervention actually made it more likely that the boys who had the treatment would offend. And in that sense, it was a kind of foreshadowing of some more recent, more famous examples. You may have heard of Scared Straight, which is probably the classic one, partly because it was on TV. So we've known for nearly a century that you can do experimental research in this field. So the question is, why have we spent so much of that time not doing it? And the answer is one that takes us through a kind of strange journey through social science, which is the topic of chapter 1 in the book. So I'm just going to pull out a few highlights from that sort of journey that I went on, trying to find out all about kind of social work RCTs and RCTs in other fields that were sort of related. So after that kind of start in the 30s, there was a brief wave of trials in the 60s and 70s. And what you find is there's kind of a wave, and then we stopped doing them for a while, and there's another wave. It's quite cyclical. So mainly in America, particularly in New York, there were a number of studies. And one was called Girls at Vocational High. Picture of the book there. And that was looking at whether, again, similar to the Cambridge Somerville study, whether social work casework could reduce offending. And just the same, it turns out it didn't. But the authors in this book that you can see on the screen, they were quite provocative. They started the book with the question, is social work on the wrong track? And I think Isabella will agree that this is likely to irritate a lot of social workers. And it came up against lots of criticism. So one of the critics accused the authors of hiding soft thinking behind hard methodology. And I think we've got a lot of academics here, so you'll recognise that as a classic academic insult, which I quite like. But the authors of the book had actually, I think, already identified the real problem, which was that social work was far too much focused on effort, whether people were trying hard, than it was on results. And they argued that the experimental method could shift the emphasis from effort to results, to find out whether the service was actually having the effects that it was intended. So that was quite an insightful observation, and shortly afterwards, some kind of legends of social work research, William Reed and Anne Shine, did something really interesting. So they ran an experiment that looked at effort and results in a more controlled way. So they looked at comparing long-term casework that was professional-led with a more kind of client-led short-term approach. Everyone expected the long-term approach to be more effective, but actually found the opposite. They found that the short-term focused casework that was more client-led actually was much more effective. And that finding transformed practice. So it led to task-centered casework, which is still something that is very influential in the field today, so it continues to have an impact. So my kind of somewhat biased interpretation of this is that the proponents of RCTs in this area had the last laugh. The supposedly hard methods revealed something that was actually really important about actually what works. And like I said, these were important studies, but after that there was a real drop-off. Something strange happened from 1980 onwards. We basically abandoned RCTs. We know this because shortly after the 90s, some people looked at the British Journal of Social Work through that decade. They looked at 356 papers and they found not one single RCT. So there's a real sort of abandonment of the method. And I think that's for a few reasons. So one was that disappointing results put people off. It's always disappointing when something doesn't work. Another one was that the qualitative tradition really took hold. There was a definite an emphasis, I think there's still an emphasis in social work on qualitative methods. And there was also a sense that RCTs were unethical, impractical, or both. And this kind of period where we didn't do much lasted right up until the 2010s, shortly before the period that Isabel talked about. And that brings me to the Social Workers in Schools trial, which Isabel mentioned. And that's the topic of chapter 10 in the book. This is one of the first big trials that was funded by What Works for Children's Social Care. It involved a team of researchers from Cardiff University and Oxford. And the people I worked with are brilliant. We had different expertise. It made us able to pull off a big and complicated study. The basic idea was simple. So rather than having social workers based in council offices, kind of away from the communities, the social workers would be based within schools. So they could work with school students, with the staff. They would be able to identify things quicker, act sooner, and hopefully intervene earlier to keep children out of the child protection system. Now, the study started just as COVID-19 hit. I'm generally an optimist, I think, but I remember saying to the team, I think we might just be done for here. It looks like schools are going to close. I don't see how this study is going to be possible. And somehow we muddled through. And it ended up being a really big study, and it took 2 years. We extended the DFE extended the funding, which enabled us to continue study. That's quite a big reason we were able to muddle through. But it ended up involving nearly 300 schools and around 280,000 students. And in what's becoming a running theme, the intervention didn't work. Don't worry, Sarah's going to be on in a minute talking about one that did actually work. So we measured lots of things. We measured child protection inquiries, child in need assessments, some care outcomes, some educational outcomes, and we found no significant effects across any of those. It's a very resounding null finding. And again, that's not what anyone was hoping for. We were hoping to find a positive result. But there are lots of positives we can take from the study. Finding out the intervention didn't work meant that DFE could have the money that they'd sort of put towards rolling it out. They could spend it on something else that was more likely to be effective. In a world where people thought RCTs were impossible, we were able to show that actually they are possible even during a pandemic. We overcame the ethical constraints, the practical difficulties, and so on. So yes, they're hard, yes, they need funding, yes, they rely on buy-in from local authorities who aren't always on board from the start, but they are doable and they are worth doing. I think the chapters in the book demonstrate that. So we're not arguing that RCTs are perfect. They need to be combined with other methods. We're not arguing that the answer to everything, but we are arguing that they're an important tool for finding out what actually works and what doesn't. And they remind us how valuable it is, even when we get a finding that doesn't show positive impact. And because we've had quite a lot of those, the ones that do feel even more kind of hard-won. So thanks again for coming. I'm sorry we don't have any physical copies of the book. I don't know if people know, but apparently they've produced them, but the pages are falling out, so they've got to do it again. But yeah,
one of the things that doesn't work is our publisher's printer.
Exactly, yeah. We need to do an RCT of that. But yeah, thanks for coming, and I hope you enjoy the book when it comes.
And now on a more positive note.
Thank you. This is what was mentioned, the world's largest RCT of family group conferences, the UK's first, and a project that I led while at Quorum, working with Hannah Lawrence and Emily Blackshaw and other fine people, not in my current role, I'm not speaking for the Children's Commissioner. And it was funded by What Works for Children's Social Care, I think courageously, given the criticisms and all the kicking and screaming that have been alluded to. I'll kind of talk through some of those criticisms and how we responded to them. There were a couple of open letters, for example, that you can read for yourself. Family group conferences, I'm going to take as read that everybody knows what they are, so maybe have a crafty Google, if not, on your phone. This was a trial of introducing the offer of an FGC to families at pre-proceedings in about 1,500 families containing about 2,600 children in 21 local authorities. And we looked at whether the children were more or less likely to go into care 12 months later, and found they were less likely if in the intervention group. So there was about 45% versus 36% chance of being looked after, so 9 percentage point difference. And it's a very interesting case study, good and bad in different ways, of evidence-based policy making. I think it's good in many ways, as Bill already said. It's the Children's Wellbeing in Schools Bill has, on the face of legislation, it has the introduction, so this is current government policy, to introduce the offer of a family group conference at pre-proceeding stage for all families. Based on this evidence. What's a strange position to be in? Is this something once before my career? And on the other hand, it's a bad example, which I will explain. First of all, it's in terms of if you imagine the sort of staircase or cycle of what's supposed to happen, the textbook evidence builds over time, the intervention becomes more robust and manualised, and so I often refer people to the staircase shown in the 10 Steps for Evaluation Success, written in the Early Intervention Foundation a few years ago. And according to that, this came along too late in the sort of cycle of development of FGCs. So they began in the 1980s in New Zealand, and there was too long for them to become business as usual in people's minds, in services, and become kind of to question, to only offer them to half the families was part of what some people didn't like. And that was one of the criticisms which I feel was not merited because of the way we designed the trial. So there was a survey in 2022 which found 79% of local authorities in the UK had said that they offered FGCs. But we weren't looking at the majority. We had 21 local authorities volunteering to take part who didn't have an existing service at pre-proceeding stage. They might have had it at other stages, and they might have had the odd FGC, it might have been spot commissions. If your social worker happened to have the time and inclination to arrange you one. So we were offering instead a lottery. It's a fairer allocation mechanism than this happening to have a social worker with a special interest. And I think that is part of the defence that we were able to mount. That this is an ethical way to distribute a scarce resource. There were those who felt that FGCs were a sort of moral right. They were the right thing to do. I mean, I work for a child rights organisation. I believe in rights and principles. The trouble is that those people don't, and some of them, they need to be persuaded with evidence. And so we all need to play the game, or nobody will get anything. So if you really believe that something works, then you can just wait for a few years, and then you can be proved right and be very smug about it. So we can all be happy. I think there's a bit of a not speaking as an academic, there's room for all these different kinds of evidence, and just because I was doing an RCT doesn't mean that other people have to not do provide the qualitative evidence, and of course process evaluations alongside are essential. And that's what one of the things we tried to do, is speak to families and find out what it was like, because it's the sort of, David mentioned means and ends, that there's the participation, the family voice, that in it is in itself an important part, and what we would like to be able to capture, and looked into whether we could. Originally, we didn't plan to do any gathering of outcome measures from families because of that staircase of evidence that we were climbing. Professor Emily Monroe had been there before and seen that there wasn't enough response from families. They're going through a difficult time. Their priority number one is not responding to a text message from some researchers. We changed our minds. We introduced it. We'd had a go. Local authorities only gave us phone numbers for 65% of families, and only 24% of them responded. So we didn't have enough to analyse in terms of the intervention versus control, and it was a waste of the people that did respond's time. So that's the trouble. The ethical dilemma is: is it a good way to take up people's time if it's not going to produce useful evidence? And the participation. We also had the argument that FGCs were very complex and taking place in a very complex social reality, which is of course true, but irrelevant given that RCTs, I'm speaking to a room of the choir here, but you cut through all that complexity with the knot. You hold everything constant, and therefore the fact that everything is very complicated is maybe, if I'm cynical, a large number of academics made a good career from saying everything is terribly complicated, but that's by the by in the case of an RCT. So there's the moral rights and wrongs, and there's the legal rights and wrongs. One of the mitigations we considered was that pre-proceeding stage is you are entitled to legal advice, and that you can seek that. Local authorities are required under the current guidance to seek families' views. This is one of the ways that they are currently allowed to, though as I say, it's going to become subject to the will of Parliament, become something that everybody is offered. And that's my concluding thought, is it's a great example of evidence-based policy making, because that is indeed the best available evidence for what should happen in pre-proceedings. But we don't have whether public money would be better spent on some other thing that you get given at pre-proceedings, or whether they'd be better off being used for children on child in need plans, or at reunification stage, or in some other way. So to finish, more research is needed.
Now to V.
All right. Thanks, everybody. It's really exciting to be here and to see a full room, both of people interested in the book, but also many people that have contributed. So yeah, thank you so much for coming. As Michael mentioned, I'm one of the co-editors alongside Dave and Michael. I work in the Policy Institute. I very freshly PhD in the Policy Institute, which I now have to say because Michael is both my boss and my supervisor. So I'm trying to get used to that. That also means that a lot of the trials that have been discussed in the book very much happened before my time. One thing that Michael didn't mention is that I'm a caregiver myself, probably to be polite, but I think it kind of explains why I'm so passionate about this book coming together, to learn what's happened already and to sort of give an outlook, or to be hopeful about what can happen in the future as well. So we've, of course, heard from Isabel, sort of like what it took for a What Works Centre to be established in this space. We've heard about the history of many trials and that history also of evidence-based policymaking in this space not being linear. And we've heard a very concrete example from Sarah about a trial that probably some people in the past would have said that's something that you couldn't really randomize. So what I would like to do is to attempt to try to tie it all together and sort of share our concluding thoughts from the book and give an outlook as well of what we hope would happen next. So as we've mentioned, the book features several case studies of how researchers have applied rigorous causal methods in several areas of children's social care. It talks about how we can collect and use data in the space, how to do it ethically. It talks about why randomization is considered the gold standard, but also what to do in case that randomization is impractical or unethical. Some of the authors talked about how we can complement our work with rich qualitative insights. And I guess the question is, where do we go from here? So what we say in the concluding chapter is something that sounds modest, but that is actually quite a bold statement, which is that what we have is enough high-quality studies to show that testing what works in a field as complex as children's social care is indeed doable, but that progress indeed is hard-won and fragile. It's fragile because we've heard about some disappointing null findings and what that can do to funders and to politicians. It's fragile because we still don't have a long enough pipeline of exciting new interventions that we can test and trial to continue this work. And we sometimes measure what's easy and not what matters. And then people quite reasonably say, well, that didn't tell me anything new. So building on this, we formulated 3 jobs for this next phase that we hope follows this book, which is first to grow a pipeline of novel interventions to test, because at this point in time, like I said, we still don't have enough interventions that are generally ready to randomize. Some would require the whole system to change. Some have already spread to local authorities everywhere, so we don't have anything to compare it to. And some are so non-standardized or flexible that a simple or like a classic RCT just wouldn't work. So unless we grow that list of things, of new interventions to be trialed, which means that we have a well-defined intervention, which also means that we have well-defined outcomes and something to compare it to, this pipeline is at risk to dry out. Speaking of outcomes, this is an area where we need to define these better in advance, and where we also need to focus on the things that make sense to social workers, to policymakers, and to families as well. We often measure what's routine and cheap and easy to do, very, very valid things like entries to care, education data, but there's some examples in the book of trials where researchers have listened to families and social workers and service users particularly, and decided to test what matters to them more. For instance, whether they were being treated fairly, whether they were being made part of the decision making, about fairness, I'm very excited for you guys to see some examples of alternative outcomes to include in maybe future trials. And then lastly, as trialists, policymakers, but also practitioners, we also need to be bold enough to celebrate good studies, even when we find that something didn't work, or we find sort of something that is a bit awkward or a hard sell. Finding out what doesn't work, as Dave has mentioned, is part of moving towards what does. And particularly in a field such as complex as children's social care, it might even be more important to figure out what doesn't work, or what, even worse, is harmful, instead of just focusing on the positives of any given intervention. I've mentioned that a lot of this book talks about the use of randomized trials, obviously, it's in the title. While also, and this is can be found in chapter 7, as soon as the book sticks together. We do obviously talk about, our authors talk about cases where randomization may be impractical or unethical. Still, we conclude that whenever we can make use of RCTs, that we should. And while there's, of course, a whole book filled with arguments waiting to convince you of this, I just want to add that from the perspective of a young person in care, decisions that are made for you can already feel a bit like a roll of the dice. You're not really made part of the process as it is, and a lot of things are happening all at once because we know how messy these situations can be. And I know that there are some amazingly dedicated social and support workers in the room that will agree that some outcomes will differ, depending on who's able to help and when. So one of the arguments we make in this book is that if chance is already part of the system, we might as well use chance well. So randomization is, in a way, a more honest version, I dare say, of the randomness we already live with. Except that this time it's in the service of learning instead of sheer bureaucracy. But, and this is a big but, what's next always has to include co-production and outcomes, better inclusion frameworks for trials, and being explicit about race, poverty, and disability in these trials as well, and in the space. I'm very happy to see Nimal and Lisa in here, who have written an excellent chapter on inequalities in trials in children's social care. And in their chapter, they say that at the heart of the social work profession lies a commitment to social justice. So I'm very excited for you guys to read their chapter in particular, and for us all to take this home and to live and breathe this as we're working in this space. And then lastly, I do want to point to one very concrete direction of travel as far as interventions go, which is cash and material support, which is something that we're exploring actually here at King's at the Policy Institute. We, of course, there's a whole bunch of case studies in the book as well about trials of fairly high cognitive load interventions for families in crisis, like parenting courses, new practice models, supervision offers. And while these are super important, I think sometimes we're still under-testing the thing that families tell us over and over again, which is that they're actually lacking resources to improve their situation. And I've brought one very brief example here of something that we're doing at the Policy Institute, which is a whole series actually of so-called cash transfer trials, which is really just where we give people cash and see what happens. And there's one in particular that I want to mention, which is really relevant to the space because it was a trial, or is a trial, where we're doing this with around 300 young people living in care. It's of course an RCT, and so in this particular case, those that were assigned to the treatment group received a £2,000 one-off unconditional payment, and we were looking at what effects that may have on things like housing stability, financial well-being, criminal justice contact, antisocial behavior, and health service use. Early patterns are looking really promising, particularly when it comes to housing stability and the use of health services. I can't say too much because we're doing very much important data cleaning and making sure that we're not overclaiming anything. But I think it's a very exciting trial that I'm very excited to be published soon, and hopefully one of many testing novel but also very simple interventions that can hopefully improve outcomes. I'll leave it at that for now. Again, thanks so much for coming. I hope we can all mingle after this and talk about our experiences. But yeah, I'll give it back to Michael.
Thank you, Bea, and thank you, everybody. So we have some time for questions and comments and criticisms. The gentleman in the back whose hand's gone straight up like a shot.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm a former law enforcement in Kerry and Sandwich and the customs and exile, and I very much recognise a lot of the points, particularly about when the message you're finding is not palatable. It can be very difficult indeed. Somebody who gave me a hard time after I wrote something which he didn't want to hear was later suspended because of the dreadful behaviour My question is on the cooperation mentioned, for instance, embedding in schools and so on. What has changed, for good or bad, from good, in who's cooperating with whom in a way that helps, or indeed doesn't help? So I thought the way really intrigued about the lady's comment about those upfront payments. I think that was really very interesting.
So just to sort of be specific, is the question who's cooperating with running trials now, or?
You treat it as you wish. Who's cooperating and who do you feel is doing it well from either side? I'll leave you to treat it as you wish.
Sure. I might give other colleagues a moment to think about that while I hurriedly throw together an answer. I think if we look back to sort of 2014 when you were doing motivational interviewing, we were doing Project Crew, and Richard will tell me what the third one is that I always forget. Richard won't tell me the... So these were single local authority trials and very, very difficult to get up and running in those local authorities, certainly the one which we were doing in Cheshire East. And we were very dependent on the pressure put on local authorities to collaborate with the intervention from the Department for Education. I remember I had a phone call from a deputy director in the DFE around this time who said, look, I see that you've proposed to do a randomised control trial as an evaluation. It's just not going to work. Please change your proposal. And I was bloody-minded and said, under no circumstances. Little did I know. And those were very novel at the time. And then we got to the stage 2018, 2019, when we were having open letters condemning me and Sarah and everybody else who could be mentioned from largely social work academics. Didn't want us running these trials. There was one particular professor of social work who was sort of nightly tweeting at me, comparing me to Joseph Mengele, which is always what you want. And so there was a lot of resistance. During the 3 years I was at What Works Children's Social Care, we got to the stage through, again, quite a bit of bloody-mindedness, where we had 110 of the 152 local authorities in England were involved in a trial in one capacity or another. And what that's done is it means you now have a situation. I do teaching for the staff college. I go around to sort of aspirant assistant directors in local authorities, and I say, we can talk about how you find out what works, and you run a randomized control trial. And when I started doing that 3 or 4 years ago, it was sort of, okay, so, but isn't that unethical? And how do you even do that? And it seems kind of aversive. I did a session in the Southwest last week to 30 local authorities. I've done it all around the country in the last 12 months. And in every single time I teach that now, there is somebody at service manager, assistant director level who's been part of a trial. And that means I'm saying, we do randomized control trial. And somebody will say, oh, I've been a part of those, and I've been part of one of those. And then when somebody from Cornwall says, oh, that doesn't seem very ethical, it's not me, like the world's largest proponent for randomized control trials, saying, no, it's fine. It's somebody from South Gloucestershire who's saying, no, actually, it's fine. And if you think about it, lots of the decisions we're making are arbitrary anyway, and so this is a way of being fairer. And that has been an absolute sea change over the course of the last decade, that you now find there are people who've done it, who've noticed that when you do it, the sky doesn't fall, and that it's much easier, and then people get on board with it. So in this trial that Vanessa was talking about, we had 9 local authorities that were basically the local authorities who liked me, their DCSs liked me the most. And Isabel has a list of the ones that don't like me at all, because they used to call her up. And I was like, we want to give some care leavers some cash at random, and both of those things are kind of aversive in a system where there's no money and randomization seems unfair. But we did it, and we ran it, and we've just launched a new study that I can't talk about very much at all, but where recruitment of local authorities for that trial has been so much easier. Because we're not saying this works, it has a massive impact, but we're saying we've done it. We've given 100 people £2,000, and the sky didn't fall. Everything kind of went okay. And what you then find is you get advocates within the sector who call up their friends and they say, so Bernie Brown, who's the DCS in Staffordshire, used to be the DCS in Bolton. But I went to her for a trial and I said, Bernie, I want to do this. She was like, great, I'm on board. It's like, also, could you tell everybody else in Greater Manchester? And then other people in Greater Manchester sign up, not because they trust me, not because they really believe in RCTs, but because they believe, as senior social workers do, in people, and they believe in Bernie. So that level of cooperation has become much, much greater over time because of the fact that we've invested in doing things, finding the sky doesn't fall, but also investing in relationships, right? You cannot, sorry to the Department of Education, you can't really convince people in children's services to like you and trust you if you're not willing to go to where they are and to work with them. And that's why I spend most of my life traveling around the country going to local authorities, because that's the only way it's going to work. But the short answer to your question is many, many more people are cooperating, and cooperating makes it sound as though they're sort of reluctant, right? We have many more enthusiastic partners than we had 5 or 10 years ago. Very long answer to your very simple question. Dave.
No, I think that's very true. The other thing I was just going to add is that I think one of the good things about the What Works Centre model is that, as well as funding evaluation, it funds intervention specifically. So rather than just going to local authorities saying we've got this idea, what do you get out of it? Well, you get a free training course. Great. In this model, you get funding for extra social workers, and that's a really big part of the kind of persuasion process, I think. And like you say, Michael, over time, I think that does generate much more enthusiasm as people get their heads around what an RCT is and realise it can be quite a useful thing.
So a possibly slightly unpopular person to quote in this context, but I think Margaret Thatcher said that no one would have known anything about the Good Samaritan if he was just nice. He also had money, so that does help.
Amanda McIntyre from the For Baby's Sake Trust. Hello. Could you say a bit more, please, about co-production on outcomes, what that would entail and what you would gain from it?
to be very clear that I have been asked to answer this by V. So I think a good example, there are a couple of different ways you can think about co-production. The first of which is we shouldn't assess fish based on their ability to ride bicycles. So we shouldn't say, this intervention that you've developed over the course of many years to improve thing X, we're going to assess it against its ability to do thing Y. And I think one of the first quasi-experimental evaluations that we commissioned when I was at WorkWorks was of signs of safety, where there was a view that the evaluations that had happened thus far had not listened to them about what they were trying to achieve, and so they kind of didn't respect the findings of those evaluations. So we did this imaginative thing of we invited them in for coffee, and we spent 2 hours working out what the outcomes they cared about would be. That's that's a very professional-led version of it. We also need to think about working with, not the families who are going to be part of the trial, and not the social workers who are going to be part of the trial necessarily, but working with families, social workers, even with young people to work out what, if they were in the situation they would be in the trial, so pre-proceedings, having a family group conference, what would they hope would come out of that? And then we need to find a rigorous and robust way of thinking about measuring that. Now, that needs to be viewed sensibly, because some things people would want to happen are not very useful. But what we found, particularly in the process of thinking about family group conferences and trialing that, is that people actually care about the things that we would measure anyway, right? So the Open Letter Brigade argued that the most important thing about a family group conference is that families feel listened to. Right? That's the most important thing. And we talk to families, actually, what they would like is to keep their kids. Like, unsurprisingly, right? I have a 7-year-old. I would do absolutely anything in order to remain in the care of my kid. In fact, if you want to ignore me but let me keep my kid, I'm absolutely fine with that. And so it's really important that we do listen to people, and we understand that what people actually want. Now, this is an iterative process. Thus far, it's an imperfect process, but it is an important process to go through. But we also have to avoid, as professionals and as researchers, pushing responsibility for the development of outcome measures for a randomized control trial onto children, right? Because we're professionals, we're adults, it's our job to do that kind of thing, but it's also our job to listen to them. So there is an instinct perhaps to veer very far away from a paternalistic model of research design and say we should just listen to the kids and see what they want us to do. But like, if I did that to go back to my 7-year-old, we would be in Legoland all the time, and that's just not practically possible, or possibly good for his development. Does anybody else want to give a better answer to that question?
So I'm certainly involved in conversations where we are looking at the potential to have a set of shared outcomes, so that regardless of, the particular interest in an innovation or a trial, whatever it is, that we're all working to the same set of outcomes. And I think that would really help us make sense of the evidence that we do have or that we create over time. So it's certainly being talked about and thought about a lot, so it's a good question.
I'm very glad that Michael took a first stab at this, because I needed to filter out in my brain what I'm allowed and what I'm not allowed to say about one of the trials he'd mentioned earlier. What I think an example from that, without talking too much about what it is sort of, there's different ways of how this can be done. In this particular trial, we worked with experts by experience to sort of check that all of our materials were in order. We didn't talk about outcome measures all too much, but I think it's really important to include those with lived experience in the research process, and not just the research process, but also in the social work practice. I think we can all do better to listen and to have conversations at eye level in this space in particular. And I think it helps us sometimes to sort of let go of the most obvious outcomes, like the ones that I've mentioned, sort of like entry into care. Like, obviously we all care about that, but there may be some softer outcomes of, like, I don't know, financial well-being, stress, sort of other things that families might be concerned about that may lead ultimately to entry to care. And I think in that sense, it's good if we continue to have those conversations in an ethical and respectful way. So yeah, that's what that means.
Here we go. There's a person 2/3 of the way towards the back.
Hello, my name is Jala and I'm a student from the London Interdisciplinary School. I wanted to just ask if you could speak a bit more about, I think at some point in the talk you spoke about how we need to develop new interventions so we always have something worth testing, and I found that quite interesting. So yes, I was wondering if you could speak a bit more on that, and also maybe possibly another question or a side note of the future of using RCTs in this research. Do you see it progressing into mixed methods research where you're kind of combining RCTs with other research methods?
So just to take the last part of that first, every single study, I think, you can correct me if I'm wrong, every single study we're talking about is mixed methods, right? So we are not randomizing, you know, as I'm mostly out of this game now because I'm old and functionally retired, but in none of the studies we're talking about are we just randomizing people to a bunch of stuff, leaving them be for a year, and then looking at what their outcome measures look like in a spreadsheet. Every single study has qualitative research embedded within it, mixed methods research by diverse teams of researchers. It's not like quants like me who shouldn't be allowed out of our windowless basements going out and interviewing people. It also involves wonderful qualitative researchers who go and do that as well as part of these teams. So we are focused on randomized control trials as a holistic method that includes quantitative methods, qualitative methods, and economic evaluation methods to say, yes, it works, is it good value for money? So this is that, you know, that methodological pluralism is absolutely essential across the entire What Works movement. There are people from most of the What Works centers, I think, here now. None of us are commissioning randomized control trials without a qualitative component to it. And that's a serious, like, you can tell how important we think that is, firstly from my tone, but also from the fact that, like, often this is more than 50% of the cost of running an RCT, is the qualitative component, because it turns out the bit where Dave goes and talks to people is much more expensive than just locking me in a windowless basement with a data set. So it is something that is absolutely crucial to everything that we do. And in fact, lots of studies we do don't have an RCT, right? We just fund the qualitative part. Somebody else want to answer the rest of the question?
Yeah, I was going to say the same. So, I mean, yeah, all of the studies we do now are kind of mixed methods, and I think modern trials tend to be, because it's the types of questions you're asking are not amenable just to quantitative methods. You want to know whether it works, but also how it might work. So a lot of the work we do in the qualitative side is trying to figure out kind of the causal link between what you're putting in and what you end up with, so you can understand how something works as well as whether it works, both of which are important. The bit about the pipeline, I think, is a really important point, because a lot of the time, as I think Vanessa said, interventions are either at a too early a stage, or they're kind of, you know, they're too diverse, so that the Hackney model, for example, has been in practice for a long time, and it's kind of been changed and bits have been taken, and it's kind of not a single thing anymore in any particular local authority, so you can't test it. Whereas at the other end of the scale, you might have interventions that are pretty new, and you generally find that people are understandably more focused on the intervention itself rather than making it evaluable. So we're doing some work at the moment with a small charity on a fostering intervention to try and put it in a place where we could then do a feasibility study. So we're doing things like theory of change work. So we're saying to them, you know, you're putting these resources in, you're expecting this outcome. What about the stuff in the middle? How do we understand that, and how do we map it? And then the next step is to do a feasibility study, then a pilot trial, and then hopefully a full trial. So if you can do that work with people at an early stage, then you end up with a pipeline of interventions that are ready to trial. You don't have to spend years kind of doing it backwards. So yeah, I think that's really important to do.
Just to also add to that, the best place for us to find interventions is by going and talking to social workers. I have so if you look at it's one of my favourite stats, which I don't have the exact numbers for, but if you look at the Education Endowment Foundation, which is the Wartburg Centre for Education, if you look, a minority, certainly in the past, a minority of the interventions that they fund are developed by teachers, and the majority are developed by either consultants or academics. If you look at the most of the interventions that work, it's interventions that are developed by teachers, not interventions that are developed by academics. Now, many academics know a great deal about education, and many of them are very, very good at teaching. However, the idea is that I, somebody who stands in front of a room of people and talks to them about stats for 2 hours and don't have to worry about behaviour, the fact that I would have the first idea, how to develop a really successful intervention that's going to work in school or that kind of thing, is absolutely mad, right? We should be looking to the people who are working with people day by day, and they will typically have the best ideas. And the problem is that they don't think of them as interventions, and they don't think of them as innovations, right? They think of them as, I've been doing my job for 20 years, and I thought we could do it a bit differently if we did it this way, so I do it in this different way. And finding those people and those nascent interventions and then working through that process that Dave describes is very time-consuming, but it is the only real mechanism we have for progress, right? We don't have a GSK massive lab where you just get a bacteria and you keep on plugging different antibiotics into it until it dies. We have to go out into the field and find out what people are actually doing.
Well, I mean, I suppose
Sorry.
I think about this point a lot, about where the pipeline's coming from, and because, the start of the story that I told was when we had this massive opportunity through the innovation programme and loads of money, and it was so startlingly different than anything else that we'd experienced. And and we're in this, we've got new money, we're in this big kind of reform agenda, which is hugely important, really making sure that across the country we are now implementing the evidence that we've built over the last few years. But at some point, and actually it's really heartening to hear that there's so much going on, because, I don't know about a lot of the stuff that's happening, and somehow we need to kind of bring it all together, because of course Foundations is doing its own stuff too, and yeah, we need
I'm
to put
retired.
it. Hey?
I'm retired.
It's irrelevant. It's not relevant. Yeah, I do, and in fact I had a conversation this morning about exactly this point: is that what are we going to do? How do we maintain the pipeline of great ideas that we can build and scale?
Question here. Let's try and do the thing I despise, which is take two questions at once and try and hold them in our collective memories.
Just wanted to go back to outcomes a bit and ask maybe for some advice, really, for something that I think I've been really bad at in my career as a social worker and a bit of a researcher, is that kind of actual process of measuring outcomes, because you've kind of talked about co-production, but I've just been always really bad at it. I'm thinking back to probably 20 years ago when a lot of us were doing, there was a lot of money for parenting programs, evidence-informed parenting programs. And so if you got trained in them, and if you ran them, you were always asked to do a before and after. And it was absolutely hopeless because the people we were getting referred were either on child protection plans, they had to come, or they'd be mandated by the court. So you would ask them this question, and they told you they were absolutely fantastic at looking after their children. And so we turned people who were already fantastic at looking after their children, I'm saying it in a sarcastic way, by the end they were either worse or just the same. And I've had that kind of experience as well in terms of research, because of shame and fear and stigma and all those kind of things. People don't always answer in a way. So I just wonder how you overcome some of those issues, because obviously there's the qualitative bit as well, but your quantitative bit is so important.
Thank you. Mike Robling, I'm from Cardiff University, the Centre for Trials Research. So I thought the observation, I've got an observation, I guess, about the wobble or the anxiety provoked by negative trial results. Funders or policy get unhappy with that. But actually, if all of our trials were positive, we'd probably be equally subject to criticism as well, wouldn't we? If everything we did was shown to be effective, then that would be a problem too, I think. So maybe there's a happy middle ground somewhere in the landscape. So that's more of an observation really, but a question from me is, what could the broader community of trialists, clinical trials units around the UK bring and support here? Because we are one of the few number of trials units who have an interest in children's social care. We work with Dave and his team consistently, but what could other people be doing to improve and take forward the field here?
Okay, so how do we measure outcomes, and what can trials unit do? Dave, it's a chance for you to get a criticism in. I think, at the risk of plugging the wrong book, I have my next book, which is coming out next summer, is about research fraud in behavioural science, which is what happens when you get 100% positive results all the time. It turns out it's just not true. Yeah, Dave, or anything else?
Shall I start with the outcomes one? The outcomes one's tricky. I mean, I think, yeah, there's no simple answer. I think if you're relying only on one type of measure, then you're going to struggle. So, for example, if you have self-reported measures only, then there's lots of sort of things to trip up with there. But what we try to do is have a combination of self-reported measures and things that are routinely collected. So we're using kind of, in a few studies I'm working on, we're using databases of metrics that are collected anyway, so they tend to be more reliable, but the downside is you can only look at certain things, so you can't look at certain, like mental health is difficult to do that way. So I think my general feeling is that there's no single measure is perfect, but a combination of different types of measures is probably the best you can hope for.
I think to add to that, there's the risk of using bad outcome measures is made greater when you're using a pre-post rather than a randomization, because things change over time and you have no control over that. So my example du jour is my son is so much better at math than he was before K-pop Demon Hunters came out, and so we can conclude that every child should be given regular doses of K-pop Demon Hunters, and if you don't know what that is, well done. It could just be he just got a bit older and they taught him more advanced maths in school. So if we have an outcome measure, people say they're better at parenting than they are, and people say they do more exercise than they do, and say they drink less than they do. If you measure pre-post, you're going to get lies at the beginning, slightly different lies at the end, noise happens. If you've got a randomized control trial, then as long as your intervention isn't making people more likely to lie, then, which it probably isn't, then the comparison between the two becomes much more valid. The risk, which Sarah talked about, is no one answers your survey, and they certainly don't answer your survey 15 times. And so then you've got garbage in, garbage out.
I could try a simple answer on outcomes. I've got a bit of a bee in my bonnet on child in need plans, such a Cinderella group, literally. Yeah. Over 100,000 children. And you could add simple data fields and capture whether the plan closes, the plan which is obviously voluntary and should have been agreed with parents. Did it close because the things in it happened or not? Did they just turn 18? That sort of administrative data improvements could go a long way to helping with, yeah.
Yeah, so the only comment, I totally recognise what you're describing, and again, it's a bit spooky actually, but today I had a discussion about, outcome measures for children's social care and how you would, how you could systematically implement those at individual case level. And maybe you can, but the worry that I have is that it drowns practitioners and administration, and how can you do it where it's not actually taking away from delivery time, and that's one of the real challenges, I think.
It's also worth saying that the Department for Education is almost unique among government departments in making large quantities of its administrative data available for research purposes in the form of the National People Database and the LEO dataset, which is, if the Home Office gave us that kind of data access, we would know a hell of a lot more about a hell of a lot more.
So
what could Mike do to...
On Mike's point, yeah, so we've talked about this before, Mike. I should have said Mike actually contributed a chapter on null findings, so he's the person to speak to afterwards. On the trials unit thing, I think, so I've found it really good working with our trials unit, partly because they've got the combination of methods expertise and the interest and increasingly experience in children's social care. And I think, like you say, that's not the case everywhere. So I think we need to encourage more and more trials units to move in that direction. And on the null findings thing, I mean, a lot of the trials I look at have null findings, but I don't really have a sense of what the kind of overall picture is. But one of the projects I'm doing is looking at that on a sample of trials to see what the effect sizes are, what the sort of the direction of the effect, also what types of problems they've been directed at. So I think my sense so far from titles of papers is that they tend to get applied to things like parenting programs, which are sort of individualized problems, rather than things like cash transfers, which are kind of structural things. So I think there's a lot more we can learn about the trials that have been done, and hopefully we'll learn more about that in the next couple of years.
Okay. I think that George is about to tell me that we have run out of time, and we can act as though that was perfectly planned and choreographed. So thank you, everybody, for being here. Thank you, those of you who've contributed questions. Thank you, those of you who haven't contributed heckling or abuse. And thank you, of course, very much to our wonderful panelists and to everybody who wrote a chapter for the book. So thank you, everybody.